What I've learned, both through research and sitting across from people telling the truth about their lives, is that real self-love is rarely loud or glamorous. It's often quiet, sometimes inconvenient, and almost always a little bit brave. And here's the tension. The very signs that you're beginning to love yourself can feel like you're doing something wrong. So what I want to do is name those signs, not the polished Instagram version, but the real human markers that something inside you is changing. You begin to set boundaries, even when it disappoints people. And I want to stay here for a minute because this is where things get really uncomfortable really fast. Most of us were never taught that boundaries are a form of self-respect. We were taught they're a form of rejection. So when you start saying no or not now or this doesn't work for me, it can feel like you're doing something wrong, like you're letting people down, like you're becoming harder to love. I used to believe that if I was kind enough, available enough, easy enough, I would earn connection. But what I've learned through the research and through my own messy attempts at getting this right is that the most exhausted people are often the ones who have the weakest boundaries, not because they don't care, but because they care so deeply that they forget to include themselves in that circle. And here's the hard truth. When you start setting boundaries, some people will be disappointed, not because you're doing something wrong, but because the version of you that had no limits was working for them. That's the part we don't say out loud enough. But boundaries are not about shutting people out. They're about letting people know where you end and someone else begins. They're about clarity, and clarity is kind even when it's uncomfortable. So when you feel that tension, that pull between wanting to be liked and needing to be honest, I want you to recognize it for what it is. It's not selfishness. It's courage. Because every time you honor a boundary, you're sending yourself a message. I matter too. You stop explaining yourself to everyone. And this one can feel almost disorienting at first because for so long, explaining has been our way of staying safe. If I can just make you understand my reasons, my choices, my intentions, then maybe you'll approve. Maybe you won't judge me. Maybe I'll still belong. And without even realizing it, we start narrating our lives to other people as if we need permission to live them. I used to think that over-explaining meant I was being thoughtful, transparent, even respectful. But what I've come to understand is that sometimes it's not about clarity at all. It's about anxiety. It's about trying to manage how other people see us so we don't have to sit with the discomfort of being misunderstood. And here's what's hard. When you begin to let go of that habit, it can feel like you're being abrupt or even rude. You might say no without a long justification. You might make a decision that others don't fully understand, and you resist the urge to write them a whole story about why. And in those moments, there's a quiet voice that says, you should explain more just to make sure they're okay. But self-love starts to shift that question. It moves from, are they okay with me, to, am I okay with me? And that's not an easy transition because it means accepting that people will sometimes misunderstand you. They might fill in the gaps with their own stories, and you don't always get to control that. What you do get to control is your integrity, your alignment, the quiet knowing that your choices are rooted in what matters to you, not in what keeps everyone else comfortable. And when you can stand in that without over-justifying, without over-performing, you're not shutting people out. You're trusting yourself in a way that doesn't need constant validation. And that's a powerful place to stand. You notice your inner voice softening. And this one is subtle, almost easy to miss if you're not paying attention. Because for many of us, that inner voice, the one that narrates everything we do, has been harsh for so long that it just feels normal. It sounds like discipline. It sounds like accountability. But if we're honest, it often sounds like shame. I can't tell you how many people I've sat with who believe that being hard on themselves is the reason they've succeeded. Like if they ease up even a little, everything will fall apart. So when that voice starts to soften, when it shifts from what's wrong with you to, hey, that was hard and you showed up anyway, it can feel unfamiliar, almost suspicious. But Here's what the research shows us about shame and self criticism. It doesn't actually create lasting change, it creates fear, avoidance, and disconnection. Growth, real, sustainable growth, comes from accountability paired with compassion. And that's the shift you begin to feel. You still take responsibility. You still care about doing better, but the tone changes. You stop tearing yourself down in the name of improvement. You start talking to yourself the way you would talk to someone you love. And let me be clear, this doesn't mean the critical voice disappears. It doesn't. It just loses its authority. It's no longer the loudest voice in the room. So when you catch yourself pausing instead of attacking, when you choose curiosity over judgment, when you offer yourself a little grace in a moment where you used to offer none, that's not weakness. That's self-respect finding its way into your own mind. And that changes everything. You allow yourself to rest without guilt. And I want to name how radical this actually is because we live in a culture that rewards exhaustion. Somewhere along the way, we started believing that being constantly busy is proof that we matter, that if we're not producing, achieving, moving forward every second, we're falling behind. So when you begin to rest, really rest, not just collapse, you might notice something uncomfortable rising up. Guilt, that voice that whispers, you should be doing something right now. And for a lot of us, that voice is loud. It's persistent. It doesn't go away just because you've decided to take a break. I used to think rest was something you earned after you finished everything. But here's the problem. There's always more. There's always one more email, one more task, one more way you could be better. So if rest is conditional, it becomes almost impossible. What I've learned is that rest is not a reward. It's a requirement. It's how we sustain the energy to show up in our lives with presence, with creativity, with connection. And when we deny ourselves that, we're not being disciplined, we're disconnecting from our own needs. And this is where self-love shows up in a really quiet way. It looks like closing the laptop even when there's more to do. It looks like taking a breath without justifying it. It looks like trusting that your worth is not tied to your productivity. Will the guilt still show up? Yes, probably for a while. But instead of obeying it, you start noticing it. You start questioning it. And slowly you begin to choose something different because allowing yourself to rest is not about doing less. It's about honoring the fact that you are not a machine. You are a human being and you're allowed to pause. You become more comfortable saying, I don't know. And this one can feel especially vulnerable because not knowing puts us right in the middle of uncertainty. And most of us spend our lives trying to avoid that place. We're taught directly and indirectly that having the answers makes us valuable. That certainty earns respect. So we learn to fill in the gaps, to speak quickly, to present ourselves as if we've got it all figured out, even when we don't. I've been there, sitting in conversations where I felt the pressure to prove something, to sound smart enough, prepared enough, worthy enough. And what I've learned over time is that the fear of saying I don't know is rarely about knowledge. It's about worthiness. It's about the story we tell ourselves that if we don't have the answer, we somehow lose our value in the room. But here's what's interesting. When you begin to truly love yourself, that equation starts to break down. You realize that your worth is not tied to always being certain, that you can be both capable and still figuring things out. That growth actually requires you to stand in that space of not knowing without rushing to escape it. And something shifts. You start listening more than performing. You become curious instead of defensive. You ask better questions, not to prove something, but to understand something. Does it feel uncomfortable? Absolutely. There's a kind of exposure in admitting uncertainty, but there's also honesty, and honesty builds trust, both with other people and with yourself. Because when you can say, I don't know without shame, what you're really saying is, I'm enough, even here. You walk away from things that once defined you. And this one can feel like grief because we don't just walk away from jobs, relationships, roles, or identities. We walk away from the version of ourselves that lived inside those things, the one that made sense of the world in a certain way, the one that knew how to belong there. So when you start to outgrow something that used to define you, it can feel disorienting. People around you might not understand it, but this is who you've always been. And there's a part of you that whispers the same thing. What if I'm making a mistake? What if I don't find something that fits me like this did? I've learned that we don't talk enough about how growth and loss often show up together. We like the idea of becoming more ourselves, but we don't always acknowledge that becoming requires letting go. And letting go is rarely clean or easy. Sometimes it looks like leaving something that still works, but no longer feels right. Sometimes it's stepping away from expectations that were never truly yours to carry. And sometimes it's releasing the need to be seen in a certain way, even if that identity once gave you a sense of worth. And here's the hard part. When you walk away, there's often a gap, a space where you don't fully know who you are yet. And that space can feel uncomfortable, even scary. But it's also where the most honest version of you begins to emerge. Because self-love isn't about holding on to everything that once made you feel secure. It's about trusting yourself enough to evolve, even when it means disappointing others, even when it means facing the unknown. And when you choose to walk away from something that no longer aligns with who you're becoming, you're not losing yourself. You're making space to find yourself again. You feel discomfort more deeply, but you don't run from it. And this is where a lot of people get confused because we tend to believe that if we're growing, we should feel better all the time. Like healing should feel like relief, like confidence, like clarity. But what I've seen both in the research and in my own life is that real growth often feels like exposure. It feels like your emotions are closer to the surface, like things that you used to brush off now actually land. And instead of numbing out, distracting yourself, or shutting down, you stay. Even when it's uncomfortable, even when every instinct in you says, get out of here, this is too much. I used to think resilience meant pushing through, toughing it out, not letting things affect me. But that's not resilience. That's avoidance dressed up as strength. True resilience is the ability to feel something fully and still remain present, to sit with uncertainty, with fear, with vulnerability, and not abandon yourself in the process. And here's the shift. When you stop running from discomfort, you start learning from it. You begin to ask different questions. What is this trying to tell me? Instead of how do I make this go away? Does it feel harder sometimes? Yes, there's no way around that. Feeling more means risking more disappointment, more uncertainty, more emotional exposure. But it also means more connection, more clarity, more truth. Because when you allow yourself to stay in those uncomfortable moments, you're building trust with yourself. You're proving that you can handle what shows up, that you don't have to escape every difficult feeling. And that's where real strength lives, not in avoiding the hard things, but in staying when they arrive. You celebrate small, quiet wins. And at first, this might not even feel like a big deal. It's not the kind of thing that gets applause or recognition. No one's handing you an award for setting a boundary or choosing rest or speaking kindly to yourself in a hard moment. These wins are often invisible to everyone else. And if I'm honest, they used to be invisible to me too, because we're taught to measure success by big external markers, the promotion, the achievement, the moment where other people can say that counts. But what happens is we start overlooking the moments that actually require the most courage, the moments where you chose differently, where you showed up in a way that felt more aligned, even if no one else noticed. I remember realizing how uncomfortable it felt to acknowledge those small wins. There was a voice that said, that's not enough, that doesn't count. And what I've learned is that voice is often rooted in scarcity, the belief that if it's not big, it's not worthy. But self-love starts to challenge that. It invites you to pay attention to the quiet shifts. The day you didn't abandon yourself in a difficult conversation, the moment you paused instead of reacting. the choice to be honest when it would have been easier to stay silent. And here's the thing, those moments matter. They are evidence that you're growing, that you're changing, that you're becoming more of who you are. When you begin to celebrate those wins, not loudly, not for validation, but simply because they're real, you start building a different relationship with yourself. One that isn't dependent on constant achievement, but grounded in recognition. And over time, those small, quiet wins, they don't stay small. They become the foundation of a life that actually feels like yours. You start choosing yourself without needing permission. And I want to be really honest about how significant this is, because for most of our lives, we're trained directly and indirectly to wait for approval. We wait for someone to tell us it's okay to leave, okay to rest, okay to want something different, okay to take up space in our own lives.